On the morning of August 26, 2026, people living along the Nepal-Tibet border had almost no warning. There was no major storm, no obvious earthquake, and yet within minutes, a massive wall of water, mud, rock and ice came crashing down the Himalayan valleys. What followed became one of Nepal's worst disasters in years. The event began high in the Himalayas, near the Nepal-China border. A huge section of rock and ice suddenly detached from the mountain. As it fell roughly more than a kilometer toward the valley, it broke apart and gathered enormous amounts of rock, sediment, and water. The result was not simply a landslide. It became a fast-moving debris flow that slammed into the river system below. The force was so enormous that seismic stations initially detected the event as an earthquake. The first automatic reading suggested a magnitude 4.4 earthquake, but scientists later determined that the shaking was actually generated by the collapse itself. The event produced seismic energy equivalent to roughly a magnitude 5.2 signal. Then came the flood. The surge raced through the Landslide Valley on the Tibetan side before crossing toward Nepal. It swept through areas including Girong, Timure, Saiprubesi, and communities farther downstream along the Boti Koshi and Trishuli rivers. At some locations, river levels rose by several meters in only about half an hour. Roads disappeared, bridges were destroyed, vehicles were carried away, homes were buried under thick layers of mud and debris. At least 19 bridges and around 40 kilometers of roads were reported destroyed or washed away. And this disaster wasn't limited to local residents. The region is an important route between Nepal and Tibet and is also used by trekkers and pilgrims traveling toward Mount Kailas and Lake Mansarovar. Nepal's tourism authorities reported hundreds of foreign travelers out of contact after the disaster, while Chinese authorities also reported hundreds missing in Tibet. But the danger did not end when the first flood passed. The enormous amount of debris blocked part of the river, creating a temporary lake upstream. Water began accumulating behind the natural blockage. Authorities warned that if the barrier failed, another dangerous surge could travel downstream. And on Friday, August 28th, reports indicated that the newly formed lake had begun overflowing, forcing rescue teams to pause operations in some areas. Meanwhile, thousands of soldiers, police, and rescue workers have been searching through mud and destroyed infrastructure. Helicopters have been used to evacuate survivors and deliver food, medicine, and emergency supplies to communities cut off from the outside world. The exact sequence of the collapse is still being investigated. Scientists also caution against immediately blaming one disaster entirely on climate change. But a warming Himalaya is making glaciers, frozen ground, and mountain slopes increasingly vulnerable to instability. And that is what makes this disaster so frightening. The flood did not begin with a storm that people could watch approaching. It began high above them, with a mountain suddenly giving way. And by the time the people below understood what was happening, the water was already there. This is the Nepal flood of August 2026, a disaster that began with the collapse of ice and rock in the Himalayas and transformed an entire river system into a deadly wall of mud and water. And for thousands of families, the search for their loved ones is still continuing.